specific passages. So,
All
okay.
right.
Let's
So
go into it.
people are filtering into the Zoom now. Just want to let you all know. All right. Looks like we have a good crowd coming in.
I was
And
just doing my spelling bee while I waited.
Okay.
And I got to genius.
Of course.
Yeah.
How is your like your tour going so far?
It's been really, really great, actually. I've enjoyed it.
Good. I think there's like unique, wonderful things about virtual events. And of course there's unique challenges too, but I'm glad it's been fun.
Yeah, so far so good.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan, and I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you to P&P Live. Thank you for your patience as we had a couple technical difficulties in the beginning. So first, I will drop a link in the chat to where you can buy Surviving the White Gaze straight from P&P's website, and a reminder that we're offering shipping on all orders. You can ask our speakers a question by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Let's introduce tonight's guests. Rebecca Carroll is a writer, creative consultant, editor-at-large, and host of the podcast Come Through with Rebecca Carroll, 15 essential conversations about race in a pivotal year for America. Most recently, she was a cultural critic at WNYC and a critic at large for the Los Angeles Times. Her writing has been published widely, and she's the author of several books about race in America, including the award-winning Sugar in the Raw, Voices of Young Black Girls in America. Surviving the White Gaze has been optioned by MGM Studios and Killer Farms, with Rebecca attached to the TV adaptation. Carroll will be in conversation with Nicole Chung, the author of the national bestseller, All You Can Ever Know, named the best book of the year by the Washington Post, NPR, Library Journal, and many other outlets. All You Can Ever Know was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, a semifinalist for the PEN Open Book Award, and Indie's Choice Honor Book, and an official Junior Library Guild selection. Chung's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, GQ, Time, and Vulture, among other outlets. She also writes a weekly advice column for Slate. Her next book is forthcoming from Echo Books. Please give our guests a virtual round of applause.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And Rebecca, I was going to ask if you wanted to read or if we should just jump into the conversation.
I think let's jump into the conversation, and if as we go there is something where I'm like, actually I addressed that in the book, maybe I'll do that.
That's a wonderful idea. I wanted to thank you so much for just inviting me to talk with you today. I've been looking forward to it. I have like followed your work and admired your work for so many years, and I feel like I've been waiting for this book, like not that you wrote it for me or anything, just that I've been waiting for this book for a really long time, and I'm thrilled. I've been thrilled from day one to hear about it, so it's an honor to be here.
To have you.
And truly, like, what a brave and wonderful book you've written in Surviving the White Gaze. Again, you're someone whose work I've been aware of and admired for so long as a fellow adoptee. Your work has really meant a lot to me personally, because I really admire the way you've always tried to write about it very honestly and illuminate its many like complications and gray areas. I think you do that just incredibly well. I always love to hear writers' origin stories, and I would love to know first just kind of what drew you to writing in general, and then also like journalism and memoir specifically, because I know that you have a lot of different overlapping types of writing experience. Did you always think of yourself as a writer? Was it like an innate drive?
Absolutely. I write about this in the book, the first essay at 6 years old, I am a Black child, filled with all this drama. And, I had written plays and stories, and I didn't realize how much it was a way of working things out until I started to sort of journal in a way that wasn't diary writing, right? Like I started writing in a diary when I was 9 or 10 years old, but it was like, well, went to ballet. Okay, good night, you know.
Yeah.
But as I got into high school and started to kind of try to figure out these things that were happening, because I had no context. I had no context to figure out how to absorb or process my racist teachers, or the fact that my history teacher was actually a racist. Like I had no so I would just write what I, and then I sort of figured, let me try to, because I'm sort of a collagist at heart, you know, let me try to find different ways to match writing with creativity and art and other things. And so I was certainly not a dyed in the wool journalist. I started writing for this school newspaper at UNH when my first semester, second semester there, and I liked it. Didn't love it. I preferred sort of opinion writing, critic stuff that had to do with art, questioning, pushing the boundaries. So by the time I got to Hampshire, I had discovered Studs Terkel, who, you know, did this sort of amazing thing of talking to people and then kind of getting into their minds and voice. So it was sort of a combination of Anna Devere Smith and Studs Terkel, my first 5 books, really, that were all interview based. Arriving, you sort of fast forward to the writing of the memoir, which I knew when I was ready to write it, emotionally and psychologically. What I wasn't prepared for is the craft of it. It's really hard. It's really hard to write a memoir because it's not just journaling. It's not just diary entries, right? It has to have a real narrative arc. And so, you know, I wrote the obligatory shitty first draft. And then my editor, Christine Pride, and I, you know, we sort of went over like the beats and the, you know, how we wanted to link this to this and what anecdotes and experiences absolutely spoke to surviving the white gaze. And so I feel like I've always been a writer, but now I really feel like a writer.
I am always just curious about how people arrive at the decision to write a memoir, because as you say, it's hard. And it's also just the labor and the work of personal excavation. I'm not trying to say it's like harder than other types of writing. I just mean like, I felt before I wrote mine as though there were certain like misconceptions or like burdens or types of pressures I had to like let go of, like unburden myself of to do it. And I don't want to speak for you or assume it's the same for you, but if there were things that you felt you had to kind of like put down or move past to be able to write this, I'd be really curious if you wanted to talk about that.
I love that question because it speaks so directly to what I have said sort of so far during this virtual tour, which is that the memories that I excavate were doing more damage inside my body, right? And so I needed to arrive at a place, because, you know, when you have memories that, whether good or bad, they give you a feeling, a visceral feeling. And once you excavate them, it's void, it's gone, right? So even if it felt bad, it's no longer a feeling. And so I had to get to arrive at a place where I was okay with letting those feelings live somewhere else and understanding that it would be healthier for them to live somewhere else rather than hold on to them.
That is amazing. I don't know that I like ever reached that point, if I'm really honest, but I think that sounds like a really, like, that's such an interesting way of putting that. And like, that's such a deep realization. Can we talk a little bit more too about like, you know, again, like I don't want to assume our experiences are like, I know they're very different having read your book, but like, I've always felt that being adopted, especially like a transracial adoption too, it tends to produce a different sort of like, I don't know, baggage, for lack of a better term. You know, are there certain ideas about your adoption or your origin story or the narrative you were given as a child, for example, or things that people said to you that you also had to kind of like, I don't know, like move past in order to write this particular memoir?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you know, and you've written about this and we've talked about this, you know, you're very protective of your adoptive parents. You wind up being very protective, which is sort of a weird dynamic, right?
Well, kind of a reversal of what most people
Exactly.
expect.
Exactly. And so, you said earlier, I don't know if you said, I don't know if I've arrived at that place that you've arrived at. I would say a good deal older, and there's that part of it as well. But I think that it was really realizing that my parents loving me and believing that love was enough could be as true as my not believing that their loving me was enough.
Mhm.
And that took a long, long time. And it also meant, what am I giving up when I acknowledge that? And to how obligated am I to walk them through it? Right. Which continues to be a really tricky, really hard thing.
I think, and forgive me if I like bring up sort of a conversation that we had a couple of years ago, but we've talked about these issues before. And I think one question you had for me was like when your ideas about adoption started to really shift, and when you began to think of it as something that was sort of chosen for you, as opposed to other people making decisions about your life that would determine so much of what came after, and really like you, the person, the subject, the object, kind of with the least amount of power in that equation. I think that realization for so many of us, again, not to speak for you, but it is like a really important realization and tends to set off this desire to tell our stories and to like challenge those narratives. For you, like in terms of like this particular book, like I would just love to hear more about like the process, like your writing process, and like were there like specific ideas about adoption besides what you just mentioned that you really kind of wanted to unpack on the page?
Yeah, for sure. And I loved that conversation that we had a couple of years ago. And as I was writing this book, it was like on every page, like everybody had the power to decide what my future would look like except me. And so, it's also sort of woven into the protectiveness we feel of the adoptive parents, but also it's like, just the other day, my mom said, we just wanted another kid. And I said, yes. And the other kid you got was me, right? A Black woman. So, it's kind of like sort of getting into interrogating the ideas of um, the things that are given to us as adoptees, the especially transracial adoptees, the image ideas, the standards, the values, the assumptions, the internalized, I am, whether, your parents or my white parents, whether or not they thought they were doing a white savior thing or the right thing, it's impossible, given the history of this country, for them to have not had some of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which doesn't make them bad people, but we do have to absolutely get inside of that before we can, change or evolve the way we talk about adoption and transracial adoption.
Yeah, and I hope you don't mind that I keep talking about adoption like so much.
No, not at all.
It's like rare and wonderful to be in conversation with a fellow adoptee. Like I feel as though so much of what your work does really powerfully is to flip that like perspective. People are so used to hearing that perspective, maybe not necessarily always a white savior narrative, but like very much a white centered narrative, like the experience of adoption, even transracial adoption, as experienced through the lens of like predominantly white adopters. And why your book is so needed and important, other than being just like a beautifully told vulnerable story, is that it is this like powerful perspective that we do not see enough of. I'm going to ask a question, and please don't hate me for it, but like I'm just wondering, like, if like was one of the things that you had to deal with in writing this sort of like the pressure of being one of not enough stories that have kind of entered this mainstream narrative to challenge this dominant white narrative? Like, was that something that like either created pressure and fair if it didn't? But I'm just kind of curious, and I admit partly because of my own work.
So I think, because we've talked, I sort of resist the conventional adoption community in that I don't want to be I don't want to be a spokesperson for adoption.
Yeah.
What I want and hope and believe is that adoptees, again, particularly specifically transracial adoptees, experiences and insights are so much bigger than adoption. I mean, and when we put it in the context, or we think about this quote unquote racial reckoning, it's like, do you want to know? Do you want to get some real information about what it's like to live in a white supremacist society and framework? Transracial adoptees have a lot of things to say about that. So I think that I didn't feel pressure as an adoptee, because I've always very much resisted being a spokesperson for the adoption community. I do feel like I want very much for there to not be just one story. I very much, as you probably know, Colin Kaepernick's story is going to be coming to the small screen by Ava DuVernay, which is fantastic. I've been writing, about Colin Kaepernick as an adoptee for about 7 or 8 years. And his evolution is super interesting. And now that he's arrived at a place where people are looking towards him, that he's ready and willing to talk about it in a way that he hasn't before, is fantastic. And so what I'm hoping is that adoption stories become bigger than adoption stories, that we are able to share our narratives in a way that broadens the conversation and changes language in a much bigger way.
Absolutely. I love hearing about like writers' processes too. Would you mind talking about that, just in terms of, and I'd be especially interested to know like what's sort of different about your process when you are, doing one type of writing versus like what you had to tap into to be able to write this memoir. Was the process during the writing very, very different for you? If so, like, just what are the differences when you're approaching those different types of projects?
Mm-hmm. So I have been and am a cultural critic. I've also, as a opinion writer for The Guardian for a couple of years, which was sort of my practice for getting ready to write the memoir. But I will say that when I didn't, writing an opinion piece twice a week, or twice a week or twice a month? Anyway, it's a lot. It's a lot to sort of try to come up with something that feels original, that feels fresh, that feels challenging, and that people will be like, "Ooh, that's it." Because there's so much content and there's so many opinions. And so, I had a very good editor at The Guardian, Megan Carpentier, and she very often helped me, go further than I was ready, or, I kind of dreaded in a way, like, okay, how do I do this so that it's really good? You arrive at a place as a writer where you're like, why am I doing this if it's not going to be really original and really move people? With the memoir, it was much more, I felt really frustrated that it didn't come right away. It's like, why isn't this coming? I'm ready to write it. And so, as I said, I wrote a first draft that was terrible. And then when I realized that what I needed to do was to tap into the things that spoke directly to surviving the white gaze, it did kind of spill out. And that was a joy. Like when I realized I wanted to start it with my experience on Pumpkin Hill, which was absolutely as visual and beautiful and idyllic as I wrote it. It was a joy to start it that way and to feel like, yeah, this was the foundation, right? And then just sort of follow the thread. I have 100 journals, that I would reference, and I have pictures and I have letters and all the rest. And so that was really like putting, sewing a quilt.
Yeah. Speaking of that, are you interested in reading just a little bit of that to kind of set, it's completely up to you.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Let me just find where I have a copy.
I feel like it's sort of mean to the audience if we mention it and I don't let you read that beautiful section.
Yeah. Okay, wait. Should I read from the first chapter?
Yeah, not to put you on the spot. It's up to you, but
I'll read from the first chapter because it's lovely. I'm going to put chocolate chips in mine, I chirped, scrambling to gather up a handful of small, dark pebbles to mix into my mud. A mucky mound, The mucky mound was fast losing its shape inside the long, narrow tire grooves of our dirt driveway, still wet from the rain the day before. The sky was a faint azure blue, and the sweet, powdery fragrance of milkweed wafted in the distance. And some sprinkles, I said, adding a few strands of freshly tugged grass from the lawn nearby, cool in my hand on a warm summer morning. Leah, my best friend, barely looked up, so intently absorbed in the creation of her own mud pie, rounding it with her fingers to perfection. Even at 4 years old, she was detail-oriented and meticulous, a budding artist who took her work very seriously, while I, at 4, had more of a collagist approach to things. The more elements and textures and ingredients, the better. When Leah was finished with her pie, she found a thin twig to outline a pattern on the top. Not as simple as a plain lattice like the apple pie crust Mom made, but tiny squares and triangles and circles interconnected, similar to a design in the pages of one of the thick art books lying around our house, and hers too. Leah's mom, Hannah, was a good friend of Mom and Dad. She'd come over with Leah in the morning and visited with Mom for a little while as we played before doing some Tai Chi in the front yard. After a couple of hours, it was time to go. Leah and I hugged our goodbyes, her soft white wisp of a body fixed inside my bare brown arms as the sun started to stretch high into the afternoon, above the trees and beyond our wide-eyed, handmade world. Bye, we simultaneously trilled into each other's ears. Okay, girls, Hannah said, smiling at the closeness we'd nurtured from when we were babies, lying on a blanket together, reaching for each other's fingertips. We'll get together again soon, okay? Bye, Lorette. Mom waved goodbye to Hannah, and Leah from where she stood, leaning against the worn wooden door jamb of our country farmhouse. After Leah went home, my sister Rihanna, who at 7 years old had already developed such a keen love for horses that it was almost all-consuming, decided it was time to play her very favorite game, the horse game. We made our horses out of chairs and used curtain sashes for reins. The solitary quiet of our house wrapped itself around our make-believe landscape so thoroughly that the damp dirt and honey scent of our horses filled the room. We heard the gallop of their hooves and felt the pace of their gait, posting to the trot, up and down in the smooth, hard dip of our saddle. Born with 2 freckles above each nostril of her nose, Rihanna wore her shoulder length hair tucked behind her ears as she led us along a winding outdoor trail. Our horses bucked and neighed as we gave their pretend bellies soft kicks. Her posture was straight, almost rigid, as she sat high and proud in her saddle. Our brother, Sean, older than Rihanna by just 2 years old, had been playing outside all morning with his friend Charlie, building and crafting and exploring and climbing. Charlie was kind and funny, skinny and curious, with buck teeth and brown hair. He rode over on his bike from town where he lived with his reputable middle-class family in a decorous house on Main Street. He loved to climb the apple tree in our front yard and sit among the limbs, looking out at the world around him, but came down to join Sean in working on his latest invention, a go-kart with coffee can headlights and a dish towel cover nailed to 4 pieces of balsa wood, somehow affixed with duct tape to an old radio flyer wagon. You're welcome to stay for dinner, Mom said as Charlie hopped back onto his red 10-speed bike to head home not too long after he'd arrived. That's okay, I'll be back, he said with a wide grin, still high from his time in the apple tree. The Carrolls, he sang over his shoulder as his bike wheels turned over the dirt and pointed him down toward the hill, where kids are king.
Thank you so much for reading that.
Sure.
It's just wonderful to hear you read. I don't think I have before.
Oh.
So, I mean, when did you start to think this is really a book? Like, this is a whole book that I'm going to write? And like, why now? Why did it feel like now was like the moment when you say that you knew you were ready? How did you know that?
So it was actually 2014 when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson. And my son asked if he and I were going to get shot because we're Black. And my son was 9 at the time. And I remember it just unleashing this sort of rage, this kind of just it all at once, kind of this rage, but also combined with the idea that the white people in my life, specifically my family, had lived so long with this kind of casual indifference to the ways in which Black people and Black bodies have been so historically killed, but also at the center of our relationship with humanity. And that I hadn't gotten any of that, and that I'd arrived at a place as a mother to a Black son who said, am I going to get shot? And I just, again, it was like I was a columnist at The Guardian at the time, and I just started sort of firing out these pieces, and that became the practice, right, of how am I going to tell this story? What about it? And little things like, that's also a place where I started to kind of mine my relationship with my birth mother, which had always been toxic, which I had always sort of like thought, okay, I'm going to look at it. No, I don't really want to look at it, right? Like, I'm going to look at it, not going to look at it. Yeah. And then I just realized, like, she can take issue with what I write or what I say, but it's my story. Again, like what I said about my mom, it's like, your belief that your love for me was enough can also be as true as my feeling that you not having any Black people in my life was a bad choice.
Yeah, absolutely. When you mentioned your son in this powerful moment, like, did you, when you started, sharing those stories, did you also think about like how, I guess what I'm trying to get around to is like this idea that is this book partly for him and partly for your own family, of course.
100%, 100% for him.
Is this sort of, I'm not trying to lead you, I promise, but like, is this something that you want to pick up and hand to him and say, this is our life, this is like our legacy, this is how we came to be who we are? Was that a big part of this for you?
You absolutely nailed it. Like, I couldn't say it better. Like, that's exactly what it is. It is for him. It is my legacy. It is our legacy. It is, it is my explanation for being extra about that he feels wonderful about his Blackness and pride in his Blackness. And, I think originally it was also meant to be a gift of sort to my adoptive family. They have not arrived at that place to receive it as such, which I also knew was a possibility. But my hope, and I don't know if you felt this when you were writing your book, is like the other thing about transracial adoptive stories is that they're weirdly interesting, right? Like, just on the face of it, like, ooh, that's weird and kind of interesting. So I really wanted to make sure that the writing stood up to the story. Like, I know my story is interesting. I've lived it. But, one of the reasons that I waited as long as I did was so that I would be able to use my skill as a writer to craft a memoir, right? And not just be like, so this happened to me, and can you believe that happened to me? Because I really spent a lot of time, talking about my adoption, because I was trying to work it throughout my life, like new relationships and friendships and so on and so forth. And, it's funny, my husband reminded me recently that when we first started dating, like, I didn't tell him about my adoption for a month, which was unprecedented. Like, almost every person I started dating, I was like, well, I was adopted and here is the situation. But for whatever reason, I think I felt like I didn't need to even bring that into the equation, because there was something so instinctively right about the conversations that we were having without that aspect of it.
I think I'm trying to understand what you're saying, and I guess I've always felt like adoptees are expected to explain, like, we're expected to educate, we're supposed to translate our families to the world, and like the world to our families, and always walk this line of, seeming happy, being grateful, and not making anyone think the less, right, of the people that we come from, any of the people that we come from. And I think what I'm hearing you say with regard to like your husband and maybe some others in your life is just like, it doesn't have to feel so hard fought and hard won, like those moments. That's kind of what I felt reading your book a little bit. Was
Yeah.
that your experience?
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you describe that, because I guess I felt like I was something that needed to be explained in
Yeah,
every relationship.
yeah.
And even as I wrote about so many relationships in the book, which was, like trying to figure myself out through these relationships, particularly pertaining to race, like all of those relationships were always like, well, on the first meeting or whatever, here's why you have to understand. I need to explain why I'm complicated, or why I'm Black and I talk like a white person, or I don't know this, or I don't know that, or like you are like a living, you have to explain who you are,
Right.
explain your reason for existing. But I did not feel that way when I met my husband.
So here's a question too, like both back to craft and just the crafting of this story, like having been sort of this lifelong educator or explainer, like being forced to be in that position kind of unfairly, like how do you resist that when you're writing, or like writing this book in particular? Because there's so much, like, it's just so easy to fall into this, not lecturing, but like when you're writing a memoir, you are literally explaining your life to others, but like how to do it in a way that feels true and not like those familiar experiences of like having to explain and translate.
I think the reason that I waited so long, again, a lot older, is that the times that I had tried earlier, it felt contrived in that way, that I was trying to explain. And here in this book, I felt like I was telling the story and not explaining. And like I have arrived at a place where I kind of just let that go, and that started again. Like I met this guy, I told him on the first date I wanted to have a baby, literally. And so that's why the book ends there, right? Is that it's not really about the past 15 years, but the past 15 years allowed me to reflect on everything that's in the book.
Were there like particular writers, either essayists or memoirists, people that you sort of look to, not necessarily as models, but like maybe just inspiration when you were working on this?
You know how hard it is to read similar treatments of your work when you're writing. Like I go sort of back and forth. It's a schizophrenic feeling of like wanting to read, like to fiercely figure out how they did it.
Right.
As if somewhere in there it's going to explain to you how to do it. But then the other thing is like I don't think I can do this, and I don't want to try to be too heavily influenced by the way that this person has done it. I was very, very influenced by Roxane Gay's Hunger and Education. And a few years back, The Glass Castle by Jeanette Jeanette Winterspoon, is it, or Winter? In any event, I thought that I was going to do that a lot more than I did. And very quickly realized that it was distracting. And so I just went headlong into just writing.
Oh, it's so hard to read like other, like especially other memoirs while you're writing one. I guess I was more thinking like the people who made you want to write this in the first place, not so much like, but I mean, yeah.
I think, my son for sure, as we have established. But my full-on squad, my girls, the people who have lifted me and have continued to listen and it really is all about support and community and having a reflection of what you've been doing and seeing the places in which it works.
I love that. I'm warning the audience that I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, and then I can definitely run the Q&A if you'd like. I'm happy to do that unless someone from Politics and Prose wants to jump in and do it. But yeah, so those of you watching, please do, if you have a question that you want to ask, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A, and I'll start those in a few minutes. I guess one thing I like to ask people, especially with a book like this, which was you waited to write it till you were ready, and it was not easy. What was your greatest hope for it when you decided to write it? And this could be something for you, your family, or it could be something for readers that you hoped. Really wide open question.
My greatest hope, and I think I said an iteration of this earlier, is that the writing would live up to the story. And that my parents, particularly, would be able to embrace the insight, and to not feel defensive. That has not yet happened. But I do feel, I feel so proud of it, which I don't think I've ever, like, apart from my kid and the life that I've made and the sort of resilience that I pride myself in, I don't, as a piece of work, I'm so proud of it. And so I think that is a best hope to embrace.
I love that. And, I don't want to like pry or ask about your, what you mentioned about your parents, but I do hope also that they get there, because I know it's important to you.
Yeah.
And then I was wondering, the book's been out for a little while, very little while, but have you heard from like many readers yet? And just if so, like, have there been any particularly like surprising or gratifying responses that have meant a lot to you?
So this ties directly into the previous question, which is that I have heard from, the range of people that I have heard from, the obvious sort of Black adoptees raised in white families, to white women, white girls, women of color, Black and brown, women who are trying to set up their lives. And it fathers, like white dads, like the range of folks who I've heard from. That is extraordinary, and actually gives me chills. But just that it has, that there, because there are a lot of threads in the book, and it could very easily have felt like digressions, at various points, so that it is cohesive enough, but also varied enough to affect and impact such a broad range of people is just amazing.
There's definitely something so universal in like what you're doing, which is like really showing how you build like a life and an identity and a reality and a family of your own. And like, I don't know, I think it makes sense to me that others would like resonate with that regardless of like background. So thanks for sharing that. Would it be okay if I move on to audience questions, and then I might throw a few of my own in as well as we go? I feel
Absolutely.
like I have 8 million more questions for you, but I want to make sure we at least get to some of the audience questions.
Okay.
Okay. So here's a question first off, from Tracy. When writing memoir, how do you approach writing truthfully while taking care of your loved ones who might read your opinions of them?
Whew. That's the thing, right? So therapy is useful. Again, without putting too much of my business or my parents' business out there, my mom, if you've read the book, is sort of my heart. Like, she is the one parent in the carousel of parents who didn't have any kind of agenda, but loved me really unconditionally. And, over the past couple of years, as I've written this book and we've had these really, really difficult conversations, she has tried to get it and tried to get there, and not really been able to. And what I realized after the book came out is that my relationship with her is more important than her understanding why I wrote the book. Mm-hmm. So I sort of shifted to just being like, we can just not talk about it. We can just say, how's it going? Did you get a lot of snow in New Hampshire? Did someone come and plow you out? I love you. I'm going to send you a cashmere sweater because you love cashmere and you don't ever spend it. You know what I mean? Like, just very, very, let's keep this simple and let's keep it lovely. Mm-hmm. She's the only one in that sort of context that I feel that way about. My sister also has been kind of amazing, and that has been also a challenging but very good relationship through this book. But I think it's about clarity and priority in terms of why you wrote the book, why you needed to write the book, and how you preserve the relationships in the way that you want them to be preserved. So has my mom always been the person who I go to talk about identity? No, as a matter of fact. So I don't need to go to her now for that, right? I've lived a long ass time without getting that from her. right? So I've now told my story. I can continue to get that kind of feedback and engagement from other folks and just let our relationship be what it is.
Okay. Here's another question. Let's see. I'm curious about conversations that you may have had with other Black women who are raised in white environments or white communities. This seems to be a narrative not often talked about. Why do you think that is? We definitely exist. And thanks, great book. Maybe I think they're also kind of just asking about reactions if you feel comfortable sharing, or conversations you've had about the book with other Black women.
With other Black women specifically adopted, or just Black women in general?
It says Black women raised in white environments, white communities. So maybe not necessarily adopted.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard from, I would say, more Black women who are adopted in white communities than men. But I've also heard from Black men who were raised in white communities. And this is something that I started thinking about when I was in college, and had met a boy. I mean, are we boys when we're 20? But who was adopted, a Black guy who was adopted into a white family. And this sort of returns to the Colin Kaepernick narrative. Most of the Black male adoptees I've met are sort of like, it's cool. I don't really need to know. Whereas Black women who have been adopted are sort of like, how is this connected to what my womanhood? How is this dynamic? How does it shape me as a woman, and what kind of woman and or mother and or sister and or, you know, all of the things that women are, specifically Black women, are expected to be. And so that's been really, that's been really interesting, especially right now, given how Black women are so, are centered-ish. I mean, the thing that happens with Black women is that, we go from being a trope or a stereotype to a hyperbolic trope or stereotype, like, Stacey Abrams and or Kamala Harris and or, folks who do really amazing, great things, and then are suddenly expected to literally save the democracy. It's been interesting to talk with Black women in general right now, but certainly Black women who are navigating white spaces and feeling like it's a moment to reset, and it's a moment to redirect the way in which we are talked about and or perceived.
Here's another question. This is from a fellow transracial adoptee. Thanks, first of all, for elaborating on how you've always kind of had to explain, we've always had to explain our experiences. I often make the joke, I've run my own PR team since early childhood. This is the person with the question. Just wondering about your thoughts on racial identity, and if you do feel it's critical to healthy development, I assume for adoptees. Or do you feel experiencing multiple, I don't know if I'd phrase it this way, but racial identities through your life has made you resilient? I feel both are true. So I don't know. I think the question kind of boils down to, like, the first part is like regarding racial identity and how that's developed in adopted kids and into adulthood. Do you think that's critical?
Yes, I think it's critical for transracial adoptees to have a community of those from which we came, which, and I say this a lot, which is that, we are our adoptive parents' children, but we are also the children of the communities of which, and races from which we were born. And we have real history and legacy there. And that's really important to foster and make available. I think this kind of goes back full circle to this moment of racial reckoning and how adoption stories are bigger than adoption stories. And that is, our proximity to whiteness, makes us real experts, in a way that we may choose to utilize however we want to. Like, I don't ever want to be a white person whisperer, but I do want people to recognize and defer to the fact that I know what I am talking about when I tell you that this white person is interacting with this Black person in a way. I see it, I have experienced it, trust.
The second part of the question is, I guess what I think what maybe they're trying to ask is whether or not you think there may be any benefits or anything that you're glad that you were able to experience. I don't know how to put this, but like that proximity, I guess, like, do you think there are any benefits to being like growing up sort of between, I don't know if that's, forgive me, this is a little bit clumsy wording, but like between communities or between identities, like, or the fact that there is like this transracial adoptee identity, like, do you feel that's been in any way a benefit, led to resilience, or I'm just trying to kind of get at the second part of
It's a tough question. I'm sure you can ask the same question, which is that how do we even begin to parse the reality of that? Like, it's so not like we don't know anything else, right? It's like that's all that it is. You know, I've had numerous sort of defensive white parents say to me, well, would you have preferred that they not adopt you? You know, I mean, it's just a ridiculous question, because that's not what happened, you know, and I can't possibly know. What I do know is that I felt from a very young age a grievance. I felt bereft. And I couldn't identify what it was. I felt like I need, you know, something was missing. And my friend Corinne says that too. She's like, something is deeply missing, you know, and I just felt that. And so what I would say to that is I would have liked for them to have been more Black folks in my life, but I don't know how that would have shaped me differently, because that's not what happened.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat sort of about birth parents, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk about that, because I don't want to push you. That said, you are really vulnerable and open in the book. Maybe a way to get at this question is to just say, like, what did you grow up kind of thinking about, like, your birth mother, and then did you often run up against other people's assumptions about, like, your birth mother, or what her story or what her decision must mean? And, like, how did you reach your own understanding of that? And please only share what you're comfortable,
yeah, of course. Of course. That's so interesting. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before, because her narrative was so dominant in my life. Like, the way that she made the decision, the way that I would come back into her life and into her fold, the way that I would build my identity and sense of self, it was all about her narrative. So, you know, talking to people about her decision never, ever came up. You know, it was always, she's letting me back in, you know, and I'm thrilled about that. And she's so cool, and she's white, and she's beautiful, you know, like, I'm talking about like being 11, 12, 13, 14, whatever. It wasn't until, and I wrote about this in the book, when I saw pictures of my Black birth father, and I had started being very interested in Black boys, that I felt like, I just wondered what that conversation was, like the actual conversation that they had, if any, when the decision was made. And, you know, again, this goes back to all the folks that tell our stories, because they have it through their mind how it happened. And all we can ever know is, you know, what we hear, but then what we feel, and figuring out a way to build or weave a narrative of those two things.
Totally. I mean, and if you don't mind my sharing, I grew up kind of hearing almost the opposite sort of thing. You know, birth parents were not involved in my life, and it was like there just been this door closed, and we were really not supposed to. I mean, the whole thing, the message was like, well, you're ours now. I'm like, that's
completely.
And I know you heard that as well. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that narrative and how you navigated both? There's this person, and, like, you know, you're in contact, but you're ours, like, you're really ours.
One of the anecdotes that didn't make it into the book was my aunt, who was my dad's youngest sister. She and I were chatting. I was visiting. They lived in Connecticut, in Groton, Mystic area, and I remember telling her that I was going to meet my birth mother, and I was so excited. And she said, "Remember, you belong to us." Right? Mm-hmm. And feeling like, wait a minute. That doesn't sound right.
Like, you belong to you, kind of.
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
But I also think, Nicole, that it would be very different had my birth mother been Black. I think the narrative would have been very different, in that, you know, there was something kind of unspoken about her okayness, because she was white. And it bears out in the story, right? Because my parents never talked about my birth father. It was almost as if he didn't exist.
This is kind of a fun question too. What makes you proudest as a mother now? I love that question. I'm sorry, I just had to ask it.
That my son calls me out for being extra, that he knows and recognizes how important it is to me to be the Black parent that I did not have. The anecdote that I tell that still, sort of shakes me is that in an interracial marriage, that we have these conversations of, well, we want to make sure that he's in spaces and places and schools where he has Black teachers and peers and this and that and so on and so forth. And like 3 or 4 years ago, when we were doing middle school, we were having this conversation, and my son was like, "Mom, my God, you are like, chill, right?" And I said, well, it's just really important, and I said, name 3 Black role models you have. And he said, Corinne, Dorlin, and you. And it had not occurred to me that I would be enough, And so I'm proud that he sees that. I'm proud that, when he was 6 or 7 years old and we went to New Hampshire, we went to a restaurant, he was like, why is everybody white here? I'm proud that he sees that there's something wrong with that. And, he's just, it's as you know, as an adoptee, when you have biological children, it's like, wow, this is kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, oh my God, I love that. I will just quickly share the first time I took my older daughter home to where I grew up, like very white community. She looked around this like 1-room airport, counted all the people, and informed me we were the only non-white people there. And she was probably 5 or 6,
Right. Yes.
And I was like, wow, you counted. And then I remembered I grew up counting too.
Yes.
And so that's the thing. I shouldn't be surprised. Here's a question. I'm 16. I find it really difficult to write about race from a personal perspective. Understandable. I sometimes write about racism, but it's hard to open up about my own experiences with it. They're kind of asking for advice on that.
I think one of the most difficult things for teenagers who are on top of everything else, really trying to figure out who they are, what their voice is, how to individuate. But what I would have loved for someone to tell me is that just call out what feels uncomfortable to you. You might not have all of the right language or the right words. You might not get it straight or right out of the gate, but I do remember that time in high school when my teacher told me that Black people don't think right, and feeling like I can't call this out. Like I can't, but you have to, for your own sanity, even just saying, what did you just say? Or can we take a minute to talk about that? Help me out and I'll help you out, kind of thing. Start that conversation, however rough it may feel, because otherwise it just sort of goes into the ether and continues to be damaging.
Like similar to what you said, you had to write about some of this too and explore it before it could stop hurting. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what you said. I don't want to get it wrong, but I think that's what you were saying.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think like to this 16-year-old, I would just, I think that's really helpful advice. What were some of the easiest things to interrogate about, like the relationships that you wrote about, maybe some things that delighted you, like that were fun to write about? And then on the flip side, they're asking, what were some of the toughest areas to navigate? And again, just share only what you want to share.
I loved writing about the speakeasy and the breakdancing days with the Black boys, when I realized that a Black boy looking at me in a way that I knew he thought I was pretty, right? Like that white boys never did. I loved that. I love writing about my boyfriend in college at Hampshire, Michael, who is still a dear, dear friend to this day. We're figuring out girlfriends and meeting Corinne, who is family to me, moving to New York, those were all kind of amazingly surprising and delightful to, and hard to, but to revisit. Hardest by far, all the stuff with my birth mother. I really, there's a lot that, as Nicole, like you write a memoir and you want with certainly about people in your family who are still living, and you want to be as compassionate, as radically compassionate as you can be. And she's tough for me to feel compassion towards, but I really tried. And that was really, really hard, really hard.
Here's another question. It's about your first draft. You mentioned it didn't feel comfortable. This is a craft question, but at what point in writing did you realize, this is not feeling right, I don't feel comfortable with it? Early on when it was actually completely done? And then how did you move past that? You talked a little bit about this, and having an editor always helps. But how did you manage to move from a draft that you were feeling uncertain about to what became the final?
I feel like this happens with other kinds of writing too. When I feel like I've tapped something and I don't dread it, then I just let it go as long as it will go. The flip side of that is it never ever works or worked for me to force myself to write. I know that some writers are like, I have to write for 2 hours every morning, or I have to, even if I stare at the page, right? Like a blank page. I don't believe that. It has never worked for me. I am a runner. And when I run, I sometimes get a sentence or even 2 or 3 words or an idea. And that's thrilling. And that was certainly something that happened when I was writing the memoir, and I would come back and I would sit down and write furiously until it stopped coming.
That makes a lot of sense. A follow-up question to that, just on my own, is you mentioned once you figured out really I need to put everything into this book that is especially relevant to the experience of surviving the white gaze. That was the phrase or the idea that unlocked it for you. Before that, this is just a question. Did you find there was almost too much, you didn't know what belonged and what didn't? And so that was the lens that allowed you to say, this stays, this goes?
Totally. And also, the premise, right, of the book, or the title of the book, comes from Toni Morrison. And when I first heard the phrase, I was in my 20s. I had never heard the idea of a white gaze, and I was working at the Charlie Rose show, and I heard her say this, and I was like, that's it. That's what I've been trying to figure out and divest and get out of and peel off my body. But then it took subsequently 20 years, right? Because once I realized that that's what it was, then, you have to look at the ways in which that white gaze has been internalized. And what you have to actually reprioritize and recenter. So it took a while, but, and you're right that there were all of these other experiences that I thought, well, that should be part of it. But I needed to see out how I had interacted with, internalized, been damaged by the world.
I'm sorry, you froze for a second, so I wasn't sure if you were done, but yeah.
Okay. Yep.
I hope that was just my end or something. I'm going to do a couple more questions from the chat, and then forgive me, I don't actually know what the ending time is, but I don't want to keep people too much past the hour.
I think we're well past the ending time.
Okay, should we make this the last question then?
I think.
Just the last question is, how did you decide that your editor was the best editor for this book? Kind of an inside baseball question.
This was a preemptive bid, and in terms of insider, that means that before it goes to auction, someone is like, I want this book. And I kind of knew that the way she had such a surety about the narrative and such a sense of like, I mean, she just was so sure that she knew how to handle it, and it just came through. And I knew that I needed to work with a Black woman, and I knew that I needed to work with someone who was ready to just guide, but also step back and guide and step back. And so we had a conversation, and that was that.
That's great. And then my last question is just, is there anything that like no one's asked you that you really wish they would ask you? And then would you like to answer that question? Not to put you on the spot, but
no, that's a wonderful question. What do I wish someone would ask me? I guess I would love for someone to ask me how I feel about the writing, the actual quality of the writing. And I would answer and say that you can call yourself a writer, and you can write. But until you realize what your voice sounds like, and people say that, I know people say that, they said it my whole life. But it wasn't until I disabused myself of the notion I needed to sound like Toni Morrison that I became a writer. And I'm deeply proud of the writing in this book.
You should be. You should be so proud of this book. I will thank you again for just inviting me. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Rebecca and Politics and Prose, for hosting. Please do support Politics and Prose and buy Rebecca's beautiful book. I don't know if anyone from the store would like to close us out here, but again, I'm just so grateful to have gotten to be here and to talk with you, Rebecca. Thank you.
This was wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. I loved it.
And on behalf of the PNP team, we thank you both for being here and giving us another great event. We thank the people who continue to support the store, and stay well read, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Bye.